Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Today we're going global. We've got a whole stack of news stories from around the world.
A bit of a world tour through headlines.
Exactly. And it's a day of some pretty stark contrasts. We've got peace talks happening, but conflicts are still raging. We've got economic worries, but also these amazing stories of human kindness.
A real mixed bag, huh?
Yeah, and our sources today are a mix too. We're pulling from international news reports, but also keeping an eye on what's buzzing on social media.
A blend of the official and the everyday. I like it.
All right, so let's jump right in. This first story is all over the news. The U.S. and Russia are sending these high-level delegations to Saudi Arabia.
Peace talks.
Yeah, peace talks. The aim is to hopefully set a date for a Putin-Trump summit and, start figuring out a way to end the war in Ukraine.
It's a good sign that they're at least talking, right? Diplomacy's got to start somewhere.
Oh, for sure. Dialogue is always a good thing. But there's a bit of a snag. Ukrainian President Zelensky, he's not happy. He wasn't included in these initial discussions.
I could see why he'd be upset. His country's literally at the center of this whole thing.
Absolutely. He's made it very clear any agreements made without Ukraine's direct involvement, he says they're off the table. He'll reject them.
It makes sense. You can't really have a peace deal without, the country that's being fought over having a say.
Right. But I'm curious, historically, have these kinds of back-channel talks, without everyone at the table initially, have they actually worked? Have they led to successful negotiations?
Sometimes they do. Think of it this way. It can be easier to get things moving if you're away from the spotlight.
Less pressure.
Yeah, exactly. You can have more frank discussions, build some trust maybe, and then bring everyone else in when things are a bit further along.
That makes sense. But in this case, Zelensky is not just sitting on the sidelines. He's up to the ante. He's demanding a share of rare earth mineral rights from the U.S.
Adding another wrinkle to the whole situation, those minerals are a hot commodity these days.
Okay, so back up for a sec. What exactly are rare earth minerals, and why are they suddenly so important in all this?
So rare earth minerals, they're this group of 17 elements. And they're kind of like the building blocks of all our modern tech.
Really? All of it?
Pretty much. We're talking smartphones, electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, even military tech. They're essential.
So whoever controls these minerals, they've got a lot of power.
Exactly. It's economic power, but also strategic power. And right now, China's got a big chunk of the market. The U.S. and other countries, they're worried about that. They don't want to be dependent on China for such crucial resources.
So Zelensky's demand, it's not just about the money. It's about giving Ukraine a seat at the table in this whole global tech race.
Smart move on his part. It's about securing their future.
Yeah, fascinating how even while peace is being discussed, there's this whole other competition going on. Speaking of competition, there's a lot of economic anxiety out there right now, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And there are some worrying signs. U.S. corporate loan defaults are on the rise, the highest they've been in 8 years.
That's not good. What does that mean for the rest of us?
Well, it could be a sign that the economy is weakening. And when big businesses start struggling, it can trickle down to everyone.
Yeah, especially small businesses. They don't have the same resources as these big corporations to weather a storm. What's driving this uncertainty, do you think?
It's a combination of things. Inflation's still high, interest rates are rising, global supply chains are messed up. It's making it hard for businesses to plan ahead, to feel confident about investing and growing.
It's a lot to deal with, that's for sure. And it's not just businesses feeling the pressure, it's everyday people too, right? Everything's getting more expensive.
Right. Groceries, gas, housing, it's all adding up. And it creates this sense of anxiety of not knowing what's coming next.
It's interesting, though, because amidst all this uncertainty, we're also seeing these incredible stories of human kindness. It's like this glimmer of hope.
We need those glimmers, don't we?
There was this story from Japan that really caught my eye. This cafe owner, he shared this story about a group of Korean tourists. They accidentally spilled a drink and they were so apologetic. Not only did they pay for a new one, they left a really nice note and a generous tip.
See? People are good. Even small gestures like that, it shows you that there's still that human connection.
It's a nice reminder that we're all in this together, even with all the differences and the conflicts.
For sure. Okay, so, ready for something a little different?
Always. Hit me.
All right, how about this? Dramatic footage from Utah. An SUV gets hit by a train, but here's the thing. It was pushed onto the tracks by a truck.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying.
It really is. Thankfully, the driver managed to escape, totally unharmed. But it makes you think, right, about situational awareness, about the risks we face every day.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like it's just luck, whether we avoid these things or not. The truck driver, in this case, he got fined. But what about the train conductor? Should they face any consequences?
That's a good question. It's not always clear-cut, is it? Where does responsibility lie in a situation like that?
Exactly. It kind of makes you think about all sorts of ethical dilemmas, doesn't it? Those situations where there's no easy answer.
I love those. Let's dive into some more of those, shall we?
Yeah, bring it on. Let's get those brains working.
So first up, a cafe owner is having a bit of a dilemma. There's this customer who basically treats their cafe like their personal office, hogging a table for hours, using the electricity, taking up space, but only buying one cheap coffee.
Ah, the classic cafe camper. It's a tough one, right? On the one hand, you want to be welcoming to everyone, but on the other hand, it is a business.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. How do you create a space that's inviting, but also make sure your business can, actually run?
Right, right. I mean, do you set time limits? Do you have different pricing for people who are staying for longer? It's tricky.
There's no easy answer. All right, ready for another one?
Yeah, hit me.
Okay, this one sparked a lot of debate online. A cleaning lady, while she's working, she eats this really expensive imported pastry. Didn't ask permission or anything. Was it just a snack break, or was it, crossing a line?
Oh, interesting. That's a tough one.
Right. On the surface, it seems like she should have done it. It's not hers. But then some people were saying maybe she was really hungry. Maybe she needed the energy. It makes you think about the context.
Yeah, and our own biases, right? Would we judge it differently if it was a cheaper pastry? Or if it was a different kind of worker?
Exactly. Sometimes things aren't as simple as they seem.
Now, before we move on, there's this news story from South Korea that I just can't get out of my head. It's a really disturbing one. A 70-year-old village head, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a 90-year-old woman. And the whole thing was caught on camera. The victim's daughter had installed a security camera in her mom's home.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
It really is, and it makes you think about how vulnerable older adults can be, even in their own homes, even in close-knit communities.
We often think of elder abuse happening in, care homes or something, but it can happen anywhere. And we need to be more aware of it, be more vigilant.
That's a really important point. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, and we've still got so much more to dive into. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be exploring the ripple effects of those peace talks, diving deeper into those ethical dilemmas, and uncovering even more fascinating stories from around the globe.
Can't wait.
Stay with us.
This is heartbreaking. But, it's not all doom and gloom. Sometimes these global events have some pretty unexpected consequences. Remember those peace talks we were talking about? The ones in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, the U.S. and Russia trying to work things out.
Well, it seems like they might have accidentally sparked a wave of patriotism in Canada.
Wait, what? How does that even work? Peace talks in Saudi Arabia lead to more Canadian flags.
It's kind of a fascinating chain reaction. It seems like the talks, along with some of the current U.S. trade policies and, the general political climate down there, well, it's led to a surge in anti-American sentiment up north.
Canadians are like, nope, we're doing our own thing.
Pretty much. Sales of Canadian flags have more than doubled recently. And it seems like it's more than just symbolic.
What do you mean?
Well, Canadians are putting their money where their maple leaf is. They're making a conscious effort to support Canadian businesses. Some are boycotting U.S. products, and there's even been a dip in travel to the U.S.
Wow, so it's a real cultural and economic shift. Who knew peace talks could have such a ripple effect?
It's amazing, isn't it, how interconnected everything is. Speaking of interconnected, remember that whole earwax thing we were talking about?
Oh, yeah, the cotton swan debate. Always a fun one.
It seems so logical to want to clean our ears out, But our bodies are pretty amazing machines. They often know what they're doing better than we do.
So remind me, how do our ears stay clean without us poking around in there?
So basically, the ear canal, it's lined with these tiny little hairs called cilia, and they all work together to move the earwax, along with any dirt or debris, toward the outer ear.
Like a little conveyor belt.
Exactly. It's constantly pushing that earwax out. So when we use cotton swabs, we're actually messing with that natural process.
And pushing the wax further in, which can cause problems.
Exactly. Blockages, infections, even hearing loss. Sometimes the best thing to do is just leave things alone, Trust the body's natural wisdom.
Good advice for life in general, I think. Okay, so I want to circle back to those ethical dilemmas we were talking about earlier, especially that one with the cafe owner and the customer who's basically set up shop in their cafe.
The cafe squatter, yeah, that's a tough one. You want to be hospitable, but you also have to run a business.
Right. So how do you handle that? How do you set boundaries without being rude?
Well, some cafe owners, they put time limits on tables, especially during busy times.
So everyone gets a fair shot at a seat.
Exactly. Others, they create designated workspaces, maybe with a slightly higher price point, or they offer like a day pass for people who know they'll be there for a while.
So you're catering to different needs, but being upfront about it.
Transparency is key, right? Okay, what about the other one, the cleaning lady and the pastry? Did we ever decide if she was in the wrong?
I don't know if there's a clear right or wrong answer there. I mean, on the one hand, she took something that didn't belong to her.
Yeah, you're not supposed to just eat other people's food.
Right. But some people were arguing that maybe they were mitigating circumstances. Like, what if she was really hungry? Or what if she needed an energy boost?
It's interesting, though, how the price of the pastry became part of the debate. Would people have been as upset if it was a plain donut instead of some fancy imported thing?
That's a really good point. It makes you wonder about our own biases and perceptions, right? Do we automatically judge things more harshly if they're expensive?
It's definitely something to think about. Okay, so before we get too deep into the philosophy of pastry theft,
We could talk about that for hours, to be fair.
well, let's get back to those peace talks, those U.S.-Russia talks. I think it's important to consider the potential ripple effects. What could this mean for Ukraine, for the region, for the rest of the world?
Yeah, the stakes are pretty high.
No kidding. So let's imagine, best case scenario, the talks are successful. They reach an agreement. What happens then?
Well, hopefully a ceasefire in Ukraine, a chance for things to calm down, for people to start rebuilding.
Right, but we have to remember, any agreement is going to involve compromises, give and take on both sides. And that could have some pretty significant consequences.
Like what? What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, for starters, Russia might demand that the international community formally recognizes their annexation of Crimea.
That's a big one. A lot of countries aren't happy about that.
Right. And on the flip side, the U.S. might insist that Russia completely withdraws all its troops from eastern Ukraine.
Which Putin might not be willing to do. It's a stalemate.
And then there's the whole issue of sanctions.
Yeah, those are a big sticking point.
Easing sanctions could be seen as a reward for Russia, but keeping them in place could make it harder to achieve a lasting peace. It's a tough call.
It's like this giant game of chess, and the whole world is watching.
Exactly. And we can't forget there's another player on the board that we haven't even talked about.
Who's that?
China. Their influence is growing all the time, and they get their own interests in this whole situation.
Right, so it's even more complicated than it seems. It's like those Russian nesting dolls. You open one, and there's another one inside.
That's a good analogy, and that's why it's so important to approach these things with nuance, to recognize that there are multiple perspectives, that things are rarely black and white.
Okay, so before we move on to part 3, I want to circle back to those economic ones we were talking about earlier. Those rising corporate loan defaults. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this stuff, especially when it seems like it's out of our control.
It's understandable to feel anxious, but I think the key is to stay informed, to make smart decisions, and not to panic.
So what are some practical things people can do to, weather the storm, so to speak?
Well, diversifying your investments is always a good idea. And if you haven't already, now might be a good time to create a budget, just to make sure you're prepared for any potential bumps in the road.
Practical advice. I like it.
And remember, we talked about supporting local businesses. That's a small but powerful way to make a difference.
Voting with your wallet.
Exactly. Plus, it's good for the community, it helps create jobs, and it just feels good to support your neighbors.
I'm all for that. Okay, well, we've got one more part of our deep dive to go. We'll be back after a quick break to talk more about elder abuse, explore those ethical dilemmas a bit further, and see what other surprises the world has in store for us.
Stay tuned.
And we're back, ready to finish our deep dive.
Let's do it. We were talking about those peace talks, the U.S. and Russia. It's a really delicate situation, and I keep thinking about the potential consequences, good or bad.
Yeah, what happens if things go well? What does a successful outcome even look like?
Well, ideally a ceasefire in Ukraine. That's the first step, right? Give everyone a chance to breathe.
The much-needed pause. But like you said before, any agreement is probably going to require some serious compromise from both sides.
Yep, and those compromises could have some pretty major ripple effects. We're talking about potential shifts in global power dynamics.
Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of concessions are we talking about? What's actually on the table?
Well, on Russia's side, they might demand that the world, officially recognizes their annexation of Crimea.
Ooh, that's a big one. A lot of countries are not going to be happy about that.
Right. And then flipping it around, the U.S. could insist that Russia pulls all their troops out of eastern Ukraine completely. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Which, let's be real, Putin might not be willing to do.
Exactly. So you get this stalemate situation. And then you add in the whole sanctions issue.
Right. Those are a big part of this whole equation.
Huge. Easing sanctions could be seen as a reward for Russia's actions, right? But keeping them in place might actually hinder progress towards peace. It's a tough call, a real balancing act for everyone involved.
It's like one of those giant chess matches, Every move has the potential to change the whole game, and the whole world is watching. It's intense.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about China either. Their influence keeps growing, and they've got their own interest in how this whole thing plays out.
Right, so it's even more complicated than it looks at first glance, like peeling back layers of an onion. Or those Russian nesting dolls. You open one and there's another one inside.
Great analogy. And that's why it's so crucial to look at these events with nuance, to remember that things are rarely black and white. There are so many perspectives to consider.
I like what you said earlier about these deep dives, that they give us space to explore that nuance, to get past the headlines and really think critically.
It's about having those conversations, right? Challenging our own assumptions and being open to different viewpoints.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to circle back to those economic anxieties we talked about, the whole corporate loan default situation. A lot of people are understandably concerned about how it's going to affect their lives.
It's normal to feel that way. But honestly, I think the most important thing is to stay informed, make smart choices, and try not to panic.
Easier said than done sometimes.
True. But seriously, if you're worried, talk to a financial advisor. If you can't, think about diversifying your investments if that's an option for you. Create a budget, make sure you've got a little cushion for unexpected expenses.
Solid advice.
And remember, we talked about the power of supporting local businesses. It might seem small, but it really can make a difference. Plus, it just feels good to support your community.
A win-win. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive for today. We covered a lot of ground. Peace talks, economic anxieties, those incredible stories of human kindness. It's been quite a ride.
It's always a trip, exploring the world through these headlines. You never know what you're going to find.
Exactly, but that's what makes it so fascinating. I hope our listeners are helping away feeling informed, but also, a little bit inspired to keep asking questions, to keep digging deeper, and to stay engaged with the world around them.
Curiosity is key, right? The world's a fascinating place, even with all its challenges.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected.